Consent of the governed. You might recognize this phrase or this passage from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. This phrase, consent of the governed, refers to an idea, a principle that a government's legitimacy and moral right to use power and force is only justified and only lawful when consented to by the people or society over which that political power, that physical force and power is exercised. And today I'll explore two schools of thought on what consent of the government means and how it plays out in practice. And neither of them actually created these schools of thought, but I think they're mostly associated, first on the one hand with John Locke, and on the other hand with Lysander Spooner. But first of all, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Boldin with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, May 1st, 2024. Before getting to the battle between Locke and Spooner, let's do a little background. This theory of the consent of the governed was a rejection of the theory of something known as the divine right of kings. And here from Wiki, they say this doctrine asserts that a monarch is not accountable to any earthly authority, such as a parliament or pope, because their right to rule is derived from divine authority. So the king can do no wrong, in essence. And that's really how the British put it in response to American colonists' claims that, well, government can only do certain things. An act against the Constitution, even though it was unwritten, was void. No, for them, the divine right meant they could do no wrong. For them, it was the king in parliament, but that's a different discussion. Thus, they write, the monarch is not subject to the will of the people, of the aristocracy, or of any other estate of the realm. And I think we can see this quite clearly in things like Thomas Paine's Common Sense. This was a big part of the views of the American Revolution, and Paine absolutely thrashed this idea of divine right of kings in Common Sense in 1776. For example, he said, men who look upon themselves born to reign and others to obey soon grow insolent. So people who have this attitude, of course, they're going to use that attitude in really bad ways. Paine writes, the world they act in differs so materially from the world at large that they have but little opportunity of knowing its true interests, and when they succeed to the government, are frequently the most ignorant and unfit of any throughout the dominions. Now, this idea of consent of the governed certainly does not come from Thomas Paine. It does not come from the Declaration of Independence. Of course, we're going to get into John Locke. It doesn't even come from John Locke. But for a little background on this, you can actually go all the way back to the Middle Ages. And a philosopher and a theologian known as Duns the Scot, John Duns Scotus. He is one of the foremost important Christian philosopher-theologians of Western Europe in the High Middle Ages, together with Aquinas, Bonaventure, and William of Ockham. And from what I know, the earliest publication of the phrase consent of the governed came from Duns the Scot in the 1290s. And that influenced a 1320 Scottish document, the Declaration of Arbroath. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. Stuart McLaurin describes it like this. The Declaration of Arbroath of 1320 is considered by some, and disputed by others, as an influential precursor to the American Declaration of Independence. The document emphasized the Scottish people's right to self-determination, defending their inherent liberties and their legitimate right to choose their own king and not be subject to the English crown. He continues, the themes of independence, self-governance, and inherent rights of the people resonate strongly with the principles later presented and argued by the American founders as they met in Philadelphia to craft the Declaration of Independence, also to craft the Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. This is all put together under these views. And Mike Maharrey also points out in a recent article, Sovereignty and Agency, which I covered just on Monday's show, in, I can't do the Latin, a document called A Defense of Liberty Against Tyrants, A guy with a pseudonym or a pen name, Stephen Junius Brutus, argued that civil government implied a covenant between the people and the king, or the government. This compact, whether implied or explicit, limited the government's authority over the people. And this is 1579, paraphrased by historian George Sabine. Basically, that document says the people lay down the conditions which the king is bound to fulfill. So they are only bound to yield obedience conditionally, namely upon receiving the protection of the just and lawful government, which is the power that has been delegated by the people and only continues with their consent. If you want to read that in full, that document will be linked to in the show notes, of course. John Milton, also in a document called The Tenure of Kings and Magistrates in 1650, put it this way: the power of kings and magistrates is nothing else but what is only derivative, transferred, and committed to them in trust from the people to the common good of them all, in whom the power yet remains fundamentally and cannot be taken from them without a violation of their natural birthright. We see things from people like St. George Tucker in 1803, who I'll cite a little bit later in this episode. He specifically talked about acts that go beyond the limits of the Constitution. These are not law. They're void as soon as they try to do it because they go beyond what the people delegated to the government. So they're void in theory. And really, he says, in principle, these are acts of treason against the sovereignty of the people. This is a treasonous act against the final authority of the people who delegated that power to government. Here's Algernon Sidney in his Discourses Concerning Government. This is what Thomas Jefferson considered the best introductory book on the principles of natural law and natural rights known to man in any language, at least at the time that he wrote about it. It was published in 1698. I think he wrote it in 1680 or so. He was put to death. It was published posthumously. He was put to death, murdered by government merely for writing this, and they found it in his home. He never published it. And so he was seen as a martyr for liberty, a hero to the American revolutionaries. But anyways, here's how Sidney put it: all those that compose the society, being equally free to enter into it or not, no man can have any prerogative above others, unless it were granted by the consent of the whole. The whole has to give consent. Unless it were granted by consent of the whole, and nothing obliging them to enter into the society but the consideration of their own good. So we see this idea of being able to choose whether or not you want to be part of the society that you're going to be ruled over. But what does that mean in practice? I'm going to try to address this a little bit later on. Sidney continues, "'Tis lawful, therefore, for any such bodies to set up one or a few men to govern them, or to retain the power in themselves, and he or they who are set up having no other power but what is so conferred upon them by that multitude." So basically, Sidney's saying everyone has to consent. And of course, Spooner's going to take apart the notion that everyone consents in a modern sense. And Sidney's also saying people can just choose to leave that, choose not to enter that society, choose to leave, create a new system. We can see all of this as precursors to the Declaration. Now, here's John Locke in his two treatises, probably the most influential on the founding generation in this view of consent of the governed, along with Sidney, but definitely Locke. He said, "The natural liberty of man is to be free from any superior power on earth, and not to be under the will of or legislative authority of man, but to have only the law of nature for his rule." So you live in the wilderness, in essence, is what Locke is getting towards. And Spooner will discuss the wilderness later as well. Your natural right is to have no one make decisions for you. He said the liberty of man in society, so there's a difference between the liberty in nature and liberty in society to Locke. The liberty of man in society is to be under no other legislative power, but that established by consent in the commonwealth, nor under the dominion of any will or restraint of any law, but what that legislative shall enact according to the trust put in it. Now, even before a lot of that, all the way back to 1620, we have another branch of this consent of the governed here in the colonies under the Mayflower Compact. And that's now actually about 400 plus years old. And here from an article by Rob Natelson, he points out that the Mayflower Compact founded Plymouth Colony, the second permanent settlement in the original 13 states, the colonies. By signing it, the parties did two things. First, they set forth their common goals. So that was the glory of God, advancements of the Christian faith, and the honor of our king and country. But next, Rob writes, to accomplish these goals, they agreed to, quote, combine ourselves together into a civil body politic and enact such just and equal laws as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. So they're basically saying, and Rob puts it the way, the signatories agreed to establish laws by common consent and then to obey them. There is definitely a will of the majority here that we're going to discuss a little bit further. Now, Rob goes on, he says, over the following century, many other settlers in America followed the Pilgrims' lead. They created new governments by common consent in territory that was either uninhabited or lightly inhabited, mostly. Pre-independence illustrations include the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1629, Rhode Island and Providence plantations in 1636, adoption of the Federal Fundamental Agreement of New Haven Colony, 1639, the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, 1639, the creation of the New England Confederation in 1643. But most of, if not all, the colonies outside of New England, the basic law was not put together like this. It was primarily written in Britain and then imposed on the people in those other colonies, like William Penn in Pennsylvania. And so by the time that the American Revolution, that is the radical change in the viewpoints of the people from 1760, 1761 through 1775, before the shot heard round the world, the Declaration of Independence, the War for Independence, that radical view of the people, by the time that the American Revolution was in full swing, the notion of government only by consent was widely accepted. This was the standard view. For example, here in 1776, in another precursor to the Declaration, primarily drafted by George Mason, the Virginia Declaration of Rights, they put it this way: all men having sufficient evidence of permanent common interest with and attachment to the community have the right of suffrage and cannot be taxed or deprived of their property for public uses without their own consent or that of their representatives so elected, nor bound by any law to which they have not, in like manner, assented for the public good. So to the founding generation, in the Lockean tradition, the consent comes in two ways. Either you personally expressly consent to something, or there's what Locke calls a tacit consent, which goes through basically your action or inaction, and your consent can come through a representative. Now, we also see these principles reflected in the Articles of Confederation and taken forward to the Constitution. Tony Williams over at Constituting America points out that James Madison discusses this in Federalist 39, pointing out that basically that the form of Republican government derives its power from the sovereign people, so the people of the several states. And second, it is governed by representatives of the people from among the people that they have elected directly or indirectly in free elections. But it does leave open, and I know some of you watching, because I've got the idea for this episode from a quote where I mentioned that phrase in the Declaration of Independence and consent of the government. I got from a comment on YouTube the other day where someone said, oh, you just passed over this idea of consent of the governed and you really didn't get into it. And, you know, I thought that was a great idea for an episode, which is why I'm discussing this today. So thank you all for your comments, whether it's live or in the archive, whether you're doing it through a review on Apple Podcasts or anywhere else. I appreciate that. It also helps spread the word because some of these major platforms, they love when you interact with it, and that tells their algorithm to show us to more people. Anyway, so it does leave open a bunch of questions. What constitutes consent of the governed? And is it really consent? And this article by Bob Higgs, Robert Higgs, called Consent of the Governed, it's a question, leads us to the Spooner school of thought. And here's how Higgs put it. One question after another comes to mind. Must every person consent? If not, how many must? And what option do those who do not consent have? And I think that's the biggest question for many of us today. If you do not consent to the system that you live under, or maybe you consent to the system how it's supposed to be, but you don't consent to what it's been perverted into, what are your options? I mean, you're really kind of left out cold in essence. What form must this consent take? Verbal, written, explicit, implicit? And if implicit, how is it to be registered? Higgs is so good at writing. If you haven't read Robert Higgs, hopefully this is a good introduction. Given that the composition of society is constantly changing owing to births, deaths, and international migration, how often must the rulers confirm that they retain the consent of the governed, and so on and so on? So he's just asking logical questions that I think some of them really don't have answers. I mean, I'm going to go through some of the views here, and I don't really even know where I land on all this. Political legitimacy, he says, it would appear, presents a multitude of difficulties when we move from the realm of theoretical abstraction to that of practical realization. And that's where we really get into the Lysander-Spooner view on this, where he's talking about consent of the governed in theory as an idea versus how it plays out in practice. I'll get to that in just a moment, but one quick second to point out that about 2 hours after this live stream is done here, I'll get a blog post published. Alan Mosley will get that organized. So if you're saying, hey, Bolden, where's that link to that Robert Higgs article? Or where do I find the Virginia Declaration of Rights or Rob Nadelson or all the stuff that you're mentioning in the show? Alan Mosley gets that organized for every single episode, and I publish it a couple hours after the live stream is done over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And there you'll also find all the different platforms we're on. Of course, we live stream on the mainstream ones like YouTube and Facebook and LinkedIn and X and Twitch. We also live stream over at other great platforms like Odyssey.com and Rumble. And I want to say hello to everyone over on Rumble. I appreciate you guys being here. There's the Ron Paul Liberty Report crew. I appreciate all you guys stopping by lately. There's Render Under Seizure, Brewster, Dennis, Gypsy. I appreciate the tip. Thank you guys and everyone else. And then over on YouTube and Facebook, there's Kirk and Alan and Brewster, White-Bearded Gnu, Kirk Morrison, Dixie, Melody, Cheriton Dave and Chris and Rick and Ragnar. A lot of people here today. I appreciate you being here, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. As I'm rambling, I'm not sure if I even mentioned the link where we're going to have the show published. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Very much appreciate all the work that Alan Mosley does to consistently get that done so I can get it published on time and out to you guys to research, read, and learn more in context on your own time. So anyways, let's get back to this discussion on consent of the governed. So we have the general idea from the Lockean tradition, how far back it goes, that consent of the governed really is consent by your person or through your representative. And so there's all these other questions, like is it express consent? Is it implied or tacit consent? Can you leave? What can you do? What are these things? Well, here's some questions from Lysander-Spooner. He says, this is in The Unconstitutionality of Slavery, published in 1860. Again, that'll be linked to in the show notes as well. Spooner writes, in this country, the supreme power is acknowledged. So he's talking about final authority, sovereignty. Supreme power is acknowledged in theory to rest with the people. Our constitutions purport to be established by the people, and in theory, all the people consent to such government as the constitutions authorize. Spooner is very detailed on these. I don't always agree with his constitutional arguments or discussions. He did a lot of writing on the Constitution other than the one quote that most people tend to cite from him because they haven't read much else. But I like the fact that he talks about constitutions because he recognizes that this isn't supposed to be just one massive blob, one national government. It's a bunch of governments with a bunch of different constitutions. And he's saying, well, in theory, the power comes from the people. And we can look at George Mason and so many others, Locke and Sidney, Jefferson and others who made this case. He said, but this consent of the people, and he puts people in scare quotes, exists only in theory. It has no existence in fact. Government is in reality established by the few, and these few assume the consent of all the rest without any such consent being actually given. So for Spooner, consent really has to be expressly made. He's saying you can't just imply consent. If you haven't escaped, you aren't consenting. That's something else. And he has an article, a very short one, called Forced Consent, written in 1873, where he addresses, well, this guy, Abraham Lincoln, he writes, did not cause the death of so many people from a mere love of slaughter. Spooner's being kind. Abraham Lincoln did not cause the death of so many people from a mere love of slaughter, but only to bring about a state of consent that could not otherwise be secured for the government he had undertaken to administer. There were people who, whether you love them or hate them, Spooner was an aggressive abolitionist. He was not on the side of the slave owners, without a doubt. I mean, he called for physical violence to stop slavery. So he wasn't on the side of the South because he loved slavery. This is one of those arguments that they want to make. They want to make you look like a bad guy if you believe in peaceful separation. Well, here's one of the most hardcore abolitionists, anti-slavery guys of the 19th century, and he absolutely saw Abraham Lincoln as a mass murderer. And he recognized that there were people who wanted to peacefully leave the system. They just wanted to leave. And then the result was Abraham Lincoln used force. And it doesn't matter who started. You can argue about that all day. But the notion that you're going to use so much force until you get people to their knees is what Spooner called forced consent. And he says, when a government has once reduced its people to a state of consent, that is, of submission to its will, it can put them to a much better use than to kill them, for it can plunder them, enslave them, and use them as tools for plundering and enslaving others. Sounds pretty familiar to me. And here from No Treason Number 6 by Spooner, published in 1870, he points out that we know historically that only a small portion, he's again talking about consent of the governed under the Constitution. He's making the case that no, this is not consented to. We know historically that only a small portion even of the people then existing were consulted on the subject, or asked, or permitted to express either their consent or dissent in any formal manner. I mean, this is a powerful argument to me, so I understand this in logic and in theory. I don't know if I agree if he's right or not, but the point is there. He's recognizing the fact that only a small portion of the, quote, the people, we the people, actually had any decision to be made, had the opportunity, were even allowed to make the decision on whether or not they were going to consent to this system. He said those persons, if any, who did give their assent formally are all dead now. Most of them have been dead 40, 50, or 60 or 70 years. And the Constitution, so far as it was their contract, died with them, is Spooner's take. They had no natural power or right to make it obligatory upon their children. The notion that you went from the divine right of kings. So Spooner he doesn't use the phrase, but in essence, it's the same principle. If there is a divine right of someone or a small group of people to rule over everyone, and then all of their children and their children's children for all history, for all time, that principle, if you're going to reject it, you also have to reject the idea that you can establish a system where certain people rise to the top, they wield power, and then your children forever, and their children and their children's children and children go on and on and on. They're all bound by that system forever. And that's how he was arguing against that idea of consent of the governed in 1870. But John Locke, I think, actually agreed with him on this. He said, it is true that whatever engagements or promises anyone has made for himself, he is under the obligation of them. So under the Lockean tradition, he's saying if you've consented expressly or tacitly, you are under obligation to do that. Now, Locke had a much broader view of what constituted consent than what Lysander Spooner. But underlying the principle, he's recognizing there is no hereditary obligation to something that your father or your great-great-great-grandfather committed to. You are not bound by that. You're a free person. You have free will. You have the right to make that free choice. So again, Locke writes, it is true that whatever engagements or promises anyone has made for himself, he is under the obligation of them, but cannot, by any compact whatsoever, bind his children or posterity. For his son, when a man, being altogether as free as the father, any act of the father can no more give away the liberty of the son than it can of anybody else. So in that principled view, Locke and Spooner are just as hardcore, and way more hardcore than almost anyone alive today. Locke again puts it like this: a child is born a subject of no country or government. So just because you're born in a particular location, to Locke, the idea of hereditary obligations is absurd. He said he is under his father's tuition and authority till he comes to age of discretion, and then he is a freeman, at liberty what government he will put himself under, what body politic he will unite himself to. So for Locke, it's basically you've got a choice. You can love it or leave it. You can stay here or unite elsewhere. Or there's another option for Locke, too, that I'm not sure is really available to us anymore. Anyways, he says, for if an Englishman's son born in France be at liberty and may do so, it is evident that there is no tie upon him by his father's being a subject of this kingdom, nor is he bound up by any compact of his ancestors. So there is no eternal obligation of all your posterity to have allegiance to any particular government. And that's the same view, whether it comes from Lysander Spooner, the individualist, mutualist, I guess, anarchist, or John Locke, the classical liberal. Here's Locke again. There is a common distinction between of an express and a tacit consent. So he's really getting into the question that Higgs was talking about, like what constitutes consent? Do you have to have a written declaration? Is it formal? Does each person have to do it? Or is there some kind of non-action? I think Higgs probably understands this history better than I do and was really kind of leaning in on that as well. And Locke is discussing this. And I think this is where he mostly diverges from Spooner, because on some of the ideas of consenting, the principles sound almost the same, but putting them into practice is where it gets different. There is a common distinction of an express and a tacit consent, which will concern our present case. Nobody doubts but an express consent of any man entering into any society makes him a perfect member of that society, a subject of that government. So if someone's just saying, hey, yes, I consent, I mean, this is very, very clear that that person wants to participate. The difficulty is what ought to be looked upon as a tacit consent and how far it binds. For example, how far anyone shall be looked on to have consented and thereby submitted to any government where he has made no expressions of it at all. And that's a huge question. How do these things play out in practice? And he said, to this I say, that every man that hath any, this is very broad, and I think this is where people run with this today, that, oh, you live here, so you will agree to everything that they do. And I think that's also taking it the wrong direction, but they get it from this principle. Locke says, every man that hath any possessions or enjoyment of any part of the dominions of any government doth thereby give his tacit consent, and is as far forth obliged to obedience to the laws of that government during such enjoyment as any one under it. So the argument would go today, and I've heard this from people, I've read it from people, oh, well, you think you're sovereign, you have your own free will, and you're not, this government's illegitimate. Well, you're using its roads, you get the mail, so they'll make these arguments that they're enjoying any part of the dominions of the government, and really, that is in line with the Lockean tradition. So, but there is a question, well, what do you do if you don't want to participate? What do you do? But he takes it even further. Whoever, therefore, from thenceforth, by inheritance, purchase, permission, or other ways, enjoys any part of the land, any part of it. So go to a park, you walk down the street, you just exist there. You are basically benefiting from the land, according to Locke. So annexed to and under the government of that commonwealth must take it with the condition it is under, that is, of submitting to the government of the commonwealth under whose jurisdiction it is as far forth as any subject of it. Now, I think in Locke's view, this is really about land ownership or land rental. So if you're someone else owns the land and you're using it. So basically it really gets down to land ownership. I think maybe a squatter probably wouldn't count, but then again, who knows? I can't really ask Locke. In other words, for him, your options are love it or leave it. And this is how Locke puts it. Whenever the owner who has given nothing but such a tacit consent to the government will, by donation, sale, or otherwise, so he's talking about property here. He's associating this with property ownership, living on the property. I don't think really he means just walking down the street existing. But if you quit the said possession, he is at liberty to go and incorporate himself into any other commonwealth, or to agree with others to begin a new one. In any part of the world they can find free and unpossessed. So he's basically saying you can stay in this country, this commonwealth that we live under, and you can be part of the laws of this commonwealth, and you can, work within the system to change them if you don't like it, Or you can leave to join another commonwealth, another country. Or if you find some wilderness, go live in the wilderness. That's fine. But Spooner will address that as well here in a letter to Grover Cleveland. In a world where there isn't much real wilderness left, or if it's government controlled, is this really even an option? And I'm not sure if Spooner was addressing this view from the Lockean tradition specifically, but he certainly does when he writes it out in 1886. This is a letter to Grover Cleveland. He says, the government denies the natural right of individuals to take possession of wilderness land and hold and cultivate it for their own subsistence. So I think Spooner recognized, like, okay, well, what if you don't consent? Not everyone has consented. What about those of us who want to leave this system? We can't necessarily go to another commonwealth who has another version of this system. Now, it may be a better system here, but he's saying he doesn't want government ruling over anybody. He believes taxation is robbery, worse than a highwayman. Because the highwayman, they come, they rob you, and then they leave. But government, he says, they rob you, and then they rob you again, and then they tell you it's for your own good. So Spooner was definitely against the system, and he wanted an out. And he understood, I'm sure, certain of it, very well-read dude, that the Lockean tradition said, well, you can just go elsewhere. If you don't like it here, go elsewhere. Go live in the wilderness. And he's saying, well, that isn't even an option because government doesn't allow us to do that. There is no wilderness that we can really, really get to. And this, mind you, this is in 1886. So there was, in comparison to what we have, certainly much more. Anyway, Spooner writes, the government asserts that wilderness land is the property of the government and that individuals have no right to take possession of or cultivate it unless by special grant of the government. And if an individual attempts to exercise this natural right, the government punishes him as a trespasser and a criminal. So in the Lockean tradition, though, government is only legitimate when it stays within the powers that were delegated to it by the people. So if the people are the fountain of all power, even if we're looking at it the people collectively, we the people that Spooner would reject, Locke would still take the position, and this went through to the founders as well, that government only remains legitimate when it does the stuff that's been delegated to it. When it goes beyond that, as St. George Tucker put it, this is a usurpation, treason against that sovereignty of the people. Here's St. George Tucker again in the view of the Constitution of the United States. And he points out that it is easy to perceive that a government originally founded upon consent and compact may by gradual usurpations on the part of the public functionaries change its type altogether and become a government of force. In this case, Tucker writes, the people are as completely enslaved as if the original foundations of the government had been laid by conquest. So to Tucker, to Locke, to Sidney, to Jefferson, government is by consent as long as you stick around, but government is only legitimate as long as it does the stuff only that is delegated to it. Now, in practice, government does all kinds of bad stuff. Everyone understood that that might happen. And, well, I think the real problem is that a huge majority of the people today actually do consent to what we live under. They think that it's not enough government. So many people love government. They want more government power over one issue or another. They may argue for less government in some areas, but more in others. But ultimately, even if whether it's more or less, most people today do consent to the system, I think, whether tacit or expressly, because they believe that the only problem is that the wrong people are in charge. The only problem we face today really is that the wrong people are in charge and the wrong people have been out of office, so they haven't been able to get in there and clean things out and put good people in there, as if somehow that's going to keep things free forever or even make it free today. So they just want things run by politicians they like. But for the rest of us, there's a small number of people. I would suggest there is a huge difference between acquiescence and consent, or as Spooner put it, discussing Abraham Lincoln and the war between the states, the war of northern aggression. I know some people call it the Civil War. There's so many different terms for it. There's a big difference between forced consent with acquiescence and submission and actual consent. And here's how St. George Tucker put it. I think this is good to close out with. The acquiescence of the people of a state under any usurped authority for any length of time can never deprive them of the right of resuming the sovereign power in their own hands whenever they think fit or are able to do so, since that right is perfectly unalienable. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. More important than anything, I hope it made you think and I hope you learned something. If you like the work that we're doing, you want to help us get this kind of information, these essential foundational principles, these important questions out to more and more people. Nothing helps us do this work more every single day, more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have lifetime, 5-year, and annual options. So I appreciate any consideration. You can join us. You can give to joining us today. Again, that's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. You can also help us spread the word by leaving comments in the archive, reviews on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, sharing links, subscribing, getting notifications, following. All that stuff will help trigger algorithms and get us shown to more people. It does help out. Every little bit does quite a bit. That's why our membership, it's only $2 a month. A couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat. We punch way above our weight class, and we take a stand for the Constitution and for liberty, whether the government likes it or not. They certainly do not. So again, I appreciate you being here. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I hope to see you next time here on the path to liberty.